this isn't right. Just because these people don't know about Jesus Christ, our people from Africa, they go to hell. And I said, Mommy, I just don't understand that. I'm kind of confused about it. And my grandmother, 6th grade education, she thought for a second and she said, well, baby, it's real simple. You're going to hear a lot of things where people will argue over religion and debate religion. She said, it's either you believe or you don't. And I choose to believe. It gives me a lot of peace in my life. You determine what you want to do. And I can't even say anything, you know. Mommy broke it down. Either you choose to believe or you don't. And that's the kind of wisdom when I go in courtrooms and I fight and everything. I always have my Millie in my ear telling me common sense things. And so
like a touchstone for you.
Yes, ma'am. She's my guiding angel no matter what. And, you know, that old thing Spike Lee say, always do the right thing. And I never forget talking to Spike Lee. I said, he was saying, when we were doing Trayvon, he said, people would always say, what's the right thing? What's the right thing? And Spike said, hell, I told them everybody know what the right thing to do in their heart. The question is, are they going to do it? In every situation, you know the right thing to do. Think about all these little black and brown people being killed in America and how we intellectually justify over and over again this legalized genocide of people of color by those who are supposed to protect and serve us. And so we know what the right thing is to do as officers of the court, as lawyers. We know what the right thing is to do, but people literally, like the Stokely verdict in St. Louis 2 days ago, how that judge went out of his way to intellectually justify the killing of this man by this police. It was outright murder when you think about it. And Chris and I were debating it, and I was giving an interview with Associated Press, and I said, you know, he wrote a 30-page order justifying the killing of this black man who he said, and it's on audio recording, I'm going to kill this ML. That's what he said. That's on the recording. And then, Paul, he goes, they chase him, and they shoot, and they kill him. There's like 8 bullets in the car. And then it's on video. He goes back to the police car, and you see him doing something, and they see a bag in the car based on the dash cam and the cameras in the car, Susan. And then he goes back to the car where the man is dead, and all of a sudden the gun is there. And he said he didn't plant evidence. But what was crazy to me is when the judge put in that order, how he said he didn't think a gun would fit in that bag, so the state hasn't proved that he planted evidence and that this was a self-defense. But he wrote 30 pages. 30 pages. And what you have to think, Ricky, is when they have to write 30 pages for something that could have been 1 page, you know they're trying to pull the wool over your eyes. And we have to stand up and reject that stuff.
And folks, for the 3rd day out on the street now in St. Louis, you know, one of the reasons I asked about your early life is, you know, a lot of times young folks, they look at someone like you and they look at their own situation, right? And figure, well, can I really do this? Can I be like Benjamin Crumb? How do I go about it? But also, I like to ask people about what inspires them. What is the touchstone? Because a lot of times that's part of what keeps us honest. Because especially for someone like you, got a mouth on you clearly, right? You're a lawyer. Now we know why he became a lawyer. A very successful lawyer.
Yes.
And it's very, very easy for somebody like that to get picked off. And if he didn't have his grandmama's voice in his head telling him, no, you know right from wrong, don't go there. And, you know, I think that's important to establish. But I want to get into a little bit about some of the legal grounds, because I know some people have the idea, some lawyers, some of whom I've met, that cases are fought and won solely by what goes on in the courtroom. And they don't really pay attention to the movement on the outside. They don't think that what is happening on the street or people's response on the street has any impact whatsoever on what goes on inside the courtroom. And I wanted to, to get your view on that, because part of that is looking at what is the role of history, what is the role of context, what is the role of the history of these institutions in terms of what happens inside the courtroom, but also finding that balance between the courtroom and the street, the legal process and the community. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I want to answer it in two ways, if I could. I'm working on a book called Open Season, The Legalization of Discrimination, and it truly is about how, from the history of the founding of this country until now, how the courts and the legislatures have found ways to intellectually justify discrimination and oppression, a lot like in your book, Susan, especially to people who look like many of you in this room, based solely on race. And it's one of those dynamics that we have to talk about, because they never want to talk about race in the court. They always try to downplay it and act like it don't exist. But when you think about the founding of America, and they talked about the 3/5 compromise, anytime you hear the 10th Amendment, that's just a dog whistle for discrimination when they start talking about the states' rights. All that really means is we're going to discriminate. And I mean, every instance when they bring up the 10th Amendment with Donald Trump and Jefferson, Beauregard, Sessions, our Attorney General start talking about the state rights. It's hypocrisy, but they're doing it as code word. And that's, we'll get to that further in the conversation. But think about the history of police in America, the Slave Patrol, and the Fugitive Slave Act, and all these things that they created just to control people of color in America. And then you fast forward when we had this great Civil War. And after the Civil War, they had Reconstruction, where they passed the so-called Civil Rights Acts, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The 14th Amendment gave us equal protection and due process of the law. And the 15th Amendment gave blacks and everybody, all men, the right to vote. Women, y'all didn't come around to the 21st Amendment. Yeah. So these civil rights amendments, within 10 years of the passage of the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, the United States of the Supreme Court effectively nullified all of those amendments. They passed laws that made them almost ineffective. Because think about it, you had the slave codes that were passed after the 13th Amendment that freed the slaves. And so for an example, they would have black people who were free now off the plantation. They would pass all these anti-vagrancy laws that said that if you were walking down the street, the police have the right to say, hey, where are you going? Do you have a job? And if you said, I don't have a job, I'm not going any particular way, well, that was a crime.
Stop and frisk. Stop and frisk.
I was getting to that. You already been cheating on my notes. That is what became stop and frisk today. The past is prologue. The 14th Amendment, all this stuff about due process and equal protection. In U.S. v. Cruikshank, they massacred over 150 black people after they had the election down in Louisiana, where these newly freed black people, black men voted black people into power, and they voted a Democratic governor into power in the state of Louisiana. I see some heads shaking. Y'all heard of this case. In that case, one of the worst massacres of black people ever, when they were in the courthouse trying to establish who was going to get the authority to representing the government in the Democratic election, the white KKK and white supremacists came with their guns and murdered men, women, and children. The Supreme Court then, what happened, the federal government came, because this is fresh after Reconstruction, and they're still saying, hey, the North, we got to protect these black people because we know these KKK and these white knights are trying to intimidate them. So the court came and they got 3 of the leaders, Cruikshank being one of them, and they convicted him of the crime of murder and manslaughter. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court, less than 10 years after the 14th Amendment was passed, ruled that the federal government only had authority that was granted by the Constitution specifically. Anything that's not granted by the Constitution specifically goes back to the 10th Amendment and states' rights. So essentially, what they said was the only protection black people could expect from the KKK and the white supremacists were going to be the state leaders of that state. Now, the state leaders of the state of Louisiana is the KKK. And so, literally, it was open season from that time in 1860 all the way up to like the 1945 for them to just kill and do whatever they want to intimidate black people. And then the last thing on the voters' rights. Everybody got the right to vote. Well, the 15th Amendment, they then said everybody got the right to vote. However, states' rights again, the states could pass laws to say arbitrary things like, if your grandfather could not vote, then you can't vote. Well, damn. What black people grandfather could vote before the 15th Amendment in the Civil War? And then the poll tax, and then all this stuff about you had to be able to recite the U.S. Constitution verbatim to vote. And so they did all these things, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, hey, again, if it is not specifically given by the authority in the language of the Constitution, the federal government can't do anything. It all goes back to states' rights. So you have this perpetuation of discrimination from the founding of the country to Reconstruction, and then right up until now, 1945, and Chris was a police officer before he became an attorney, so we talk a lot. He gives me a different perspective. I still challenge him on everything. But it's interesting to know some of the psychology behind how police officers think. And my little brother is a police officer, so I always tell people it's not that we're against police officers, we're against bad police officers who kill us and brutalize us and those type of things. But in 1945 was the first time in the United States of America where the Supreme Court of the United States spoke on police brutality. It was a case called U.S. v. Screws. Screws, a young black man, sheriff and his 2 deputies beat the hell out of him, killed them right there in Courthouse Square in a small town in Georgia. The federal government, the Justice Department convicted the sheriff. They found him guilty, and he was in jail. They appealed it. It went up to the Supreme Court. Now, while he was in jail, ironically, he got reelected sheriff. So, Susan, you know what we're dealing with. This is the South. And I will say, normally when I use the South, shock, I'm using Malcolm X's definition of the South. Anything below the Canadian border. But in this particular case, the Supreme Court ruled that the Department of Justice and the federal government had no right to do anything if he was going to be convicted. The state of Georgia and the state attorney would have to do it just like with Michael Brown, just like with Eric Gardner, just like with Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Stokely, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, and the list goes on and on. If the local prosecutors are going to do anything, the Supreme Court has said that the federal government is going to be prohibited to do anything, and that's still the system today. But what is particularly important